Hey there, this is Colin Marshall, host of the Marketplace of Ideas, just breaking in a little bit early on the show to let you know that I will never charge you for this program. Not going to pass the hat around, not going to do any of that stuff. But if you do enjoy the Marketplace, I do ask that you blog about it, you tweet about it, you live journal about it, you Facebook about it, you MySpace about it, you Tumblr about it. You get the word out about this program, because the more people know about it, the better it's going to be. This week on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about the craft of interviewing in the state of public radio today with Jesse Thorn, host and producer of Public Radio International's The Sound of Young America. Jesse Thorn is the host and producer of Public Radio International's The Sound of Young America. He's also the founder, proprietor, and principal of the podcasting empire that is MaximumFun.org. Jesse, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
The first thing we should do, because there's going to be people listening who have not heard of The Sound, who haven't heard of Maximum Fun, we got to do some awareness raising first. So could you tell us what makes The Sound different from other, specifically public radio interview shows one might hear just going across the dial?
More awesome?
More awesome. How much more?
The premise of the show is a public radio show about things that are awesome. What that translates to is essentially a public radio show from my editorial perspective. And we focus on things that are fun and funny. Which means you get a much kind of, for lack of a less annoying word, a hipper public radio show, but you also get a lot more comedy, a lot more indie rock and hip hop and books about things that are fascinating.
Now, is this sort of thing totally absent from the public radio airwaves other than on your show? I mean, I feel like I haven't heard many comedians anywhere else but on your show.
Yeah, well, I mean, comedians are almost totally absent from anywhere in, serious public discourse, unfortunately. The kind of stuff that I cover on my show occasionally pops up on other public radio outlets. There have also been public radio attempts to sort of hew to this formula in a more kind of system-wide or big money type of way that have thus far failed. Usually if you hear someone who's been on my show, on another show, whether it's a good one or a bad one, it could be on Fresh Air, which is one of my, favorite shows in the world. When you hear that person, it's like they're a visitor. They're not native to those other programs. They're sort of a curiosity or a novelty, or they focus on some aspect of their story that doesn't have a lot to do with their work, maybe has more to do with just kind of the kind of narrative theme that somebody picks out for a newspaper feature story. So-and-so happened to be raised by dogs or whatever. So on my show, I like to think that those things are a little bit more at home.
So you provide a home for these sorts of comedians, rappers, these kinds of people who find the rest of public radio to be a storm that they need to find a port in. You'd be that port, I suppose. Now, what about your show makes that their home? Just because you know more about what they actually do and you're not simply trying to look for a public radio-y way to bring some foreign cultural creator onto the scene?
Yeah, well, I mean, know and care more about what they actually do. Ultimately, from my perspective, my show is at its best when I really care about what's going on the air. And not just care about it in the sense that, I want to make a good product, although obviously I do. But, when I interview somebody that I really care about their work, I think it shows. Just like it does on other shows. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the show 6 Feet Under. I mean, I'm not against it, but I wasn't that into it. But when Terry Gross talks to somebody who was on 6 Feet Under, you can tell she really loved 6 Feet Under, and I think it really brightens up the interview, and in a way that just reading a lot of things that a producer printed out and handed to you doesn't. Really understanding the cultural context for something. I just try and bring some of myself to the show. I mean, as far as why people feel at home on the show, Well, for one thing, it's literally in my home. Like, I think 90% of my guests, at least, are comforted by the fact that when they show up to do this radio interview, it's at an apartment building. And, I come down to meet them at the gate and say, and then welcome them literally into my apartment where I live, which is where my studio is. But, it's also just a lot of folks, folks make their life creating something. And it's really gratifying, I think, to have someone take it as seriously as they do. And that's what I try and do with stuff that often doesn't get a chance to be taken seriously. I mean, if you're a comedian, a lot of times if you're getting interviewed, they're either setting you up for your jokes. That's sort of the best case scenario. Or the worst case scenario is they're setting you up for jokes that they expect you to generate on the spot that in their mind is a good setup for ad joke. So, I just try and make it a welcoming place for people and a place where it's clear that I actually give a hoot.
This issue of the fact that it's recorded in your Los Angeles apartment there in beautiful Koreatown. Now, you say that it's comforting for guests.
I should correct you. Koreatown is not very beautiful.
In hideous Koreatown, these guests drive up. And
hideous also seems like an overstatement. I mean, it's soiled.
In soiled Korea, these guests drive through soiled Koreatown, desperately trying to find your apartment. They get there. You say they're comforted by it, which is actually nice to hear, because I was wondering, I was going to ask about this. You say there's a 90% comfort to this. Are the 10% weirded out? Do they just walk away, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, most of them are weirded out. It's odd, you know what I mean? But I think being upfront about the fact that it's odd really deflects a lot of the, negative problems that I might otherwise have had. I mean, ultimately, somebody comes to my gate and they may or may not have heard from their publicist that this was going to be in an apartment building. And they think it's odd, but usually they're not like upset by it. Once in a while somebody is worried that this is going to be like a 2-bit operation. But I think that can be allayed by, them sitting down and within 5 minutes of me asking them questions, it's clear that it's not, I think. I'm a professional at what I do. Given that, I mean, most people are sort of artists are interested in DIY, you know what I mean? And they can understand immediately why I would want to do the show, a show that's so personal in a way that, maybe a publicist might not.
To talk a little bit about how this show became what it is, we have to go back to its roots, and I'm not going to make you retell the story about how you started it on KZSC, UC Santa Cruz's radio station. And this program is actually broadcasting out of KCSB, the station that broadcasts from UC Santa Barbara. We're both proud products of the middle tier of the University of California system.
And I would argue that I'm a product of the lower tier of the University of California system, but yes, continue.
And when, correct me if I have any of this wrong, but then the KZSC show was picked up by the local public radio station in Santa Cruz, and then from there syndicated to something like a Hattiesburg, was it? And then after that, WNYC a little later, and then PRI, Public Radio International.
Yeah, pretty much. I actually started on Hattiesburg first.
Oh, okay.
Oddly enough. But yeah, besides that, you've got the story straight.
Okay, so it comes up from a college radio show. And if I also have these facts straight, these were not producer-collected facts. I desperately hunted for them myself, or kind of absorbed them over listening to your program, that the sound began as a bit of what I would call a hangout college variety show early on, where you had some friends in there and you were doing kind of whatever you thought might make a good, fun listening experience. But then you started bringing guests on. Now, hearing an interview from those days, what would be the most obvious differences in your interview style between a Sound of Young America from 2009 and one from the dawn of the show?
Well, I mean, in the very beginning of the show, we started booking interview guests essentially because the smallest block of time available on KZSE was 1 hour a week. And we knew that we didn't just want to play records. I mean, we did play a fair volume of records at the time to fill. But we didn't just want to be a show where we pretended to be a talk show, but actually we're just playing CDs. We realized very quickly that an hour a week is just a lot of original content to generate. And we figured out that I can't remember who we booked like right at first. I remember like some of the early ones were like Matt Besser from the Upright Citizens Brigade. Dick Dale, the King of the Surf Guitar, was a really early one. Folks like that, just people who happen to have their email address on their website. And we realized that if we interviewed them, that would fill half a show where all the pressure was basically on the guest to be interesting.
You put the pressure on Dick Dale and hope for the best.
Yeah, that's not a good plan, actually, as it turns out. But he'll just start claiming to have invented genres of music. Like in terms of style, well, for one thing, there was 3 of us at the time. And Gene never participated much in the interviews, but Jordan, who now does Jordan Jesse Go with me, did actively. And so if you listen hard enough, you can probably hear us wildly like flipping our heads back and forth at each other and gesticulating, trying to figure out who had an idea for what the next question would be. And I feel really lucky to have learned to do interviews in a context where if I didn't have anything, I could just like put my palms up in the air and open my eyes wide and shake my head like I got nothing, and like start pointing at Jordan and Gene, and then one of them would raise their hand and be like, okay, silently, while the other person was talking, while the guest was talking on the phone. So you can hear that part of it. You just get more comfortable doing it after a long time. I mean, I've been doing it for so long, I don't feel like I never got any instruction on how to do it. I just try and remember to ask questions instead of making statements,
When you started doing the interviews, you're bearing the brunt of them yourself when there were no co-hosts. Did you look to any other public radio or in any other form examples of the interviewing craft, or was this all is your style completely a product of trial and error?
For the most part, it's a product of trial and error. There's not a lot of art there. But in terms of folks who I've really admired their interviewing style, I would probably say, well, of course, Terry Gross, which is the sort of the obvious answer. But I think, any interviewer who's not a fool can learn so much from listening to Terry Gross. She's completely unassuming and always asks people for examples. And always ask people the questions that you would want to hear the answers to. And she's always Terry Gross, and I think that's really amazing. Another is actually Conan O'Brien. I'm a big Conan O'Brien fan, but I'm not as big a Conan O'Brien fan as some people are. I mean, my real hero is probably David Letterman more than Conan, but one of the things that Conan does really amazingly in these what amount to like almost scripted interviews is he's fantastically funny without ever taking the focus from his guest or making the humor at the expense of his guest. And that's something that's very difficult to do and that I've tried to learn from. I mean, he's obviously a million, trillion, billion times funnier than me. He's the kind of person who's, a 1 in a million funniness. Probably more than 1 in a million funniness. But I think his balance between keeping the focus on the guest and being funny is something that I really admire.
It's fascinating that you bring up those 2 examples, the example of Conan O'Brien and of Terry Gross. In some ways, they seem like a study in contrast to me because I listen to Terry Gross and no one would argue that Terry Gross doesn't do a good job. But she has a very particular interview style, I would say, where it seems like if Terry Gross could come up with a question that was such a genius question that it would just kick off the guest to speak intelligently for the remainder of the interview, and she wouldn't have to say another question because that question was so good, she would do that. Whereas it seems like with Conan O'Brien and that sort of type, there's more willing injection of their own personality, I suppose I would say. What kind of a balance have you found yourself having to strike between sort of the facilitated speech mode of interviewing and the put your own personality in there mode?
Yeah, I mean, I think of myself as being in the facilitated speech mode, but then I talk to, some public radio program director, and they think I'm like the most outrageously personality-driven radio host in history. So like I learned from those like outside like people whose world is public radio, and for public radio people, their world really tends to be public radio. They think I'm like insane. They think they're like, God, stop interjecting things. Stop adding to the conversation. I can understand that, but like like I said, one of the reasons I really admire Conan O'Brien is that in his interviews, unless it's someone really awful, the interview stays on the guest, and he's trying to make the guest look good. I have the opportunity of having half an hour instead of 7 minutes, and being on the radio instead of being on television, where you can be a lot more abstract. And so, a big part of my goal is to get a lot of information out of a guest in a way that Conan O'Brien isn't trying to do. But I wouldn't want to be like David Letterman interviewing a guest. And again, if I was going to pick one person as the greatest person in the world, it would be David Letterman. But David Letterman sort of like... his interviews are often sort of like a fight with the guest, where
in the case of Crispin Glover, maybe literally a fight.
Yeah, I mean, well, where Letterman is playing he's playing the game at a level that's so far above anyone else that he's either sort of like he's like a cat playing with a ball of string. Whether it's positive or negative. I mean, I don't think a lot of people think that he's a lot more of a jerk than I do. I mean, I think he often really enjoys his guests, but he's such a funniness genius that it's so obvious in the interviews that it's sort of like he's riding a spaceship and everybody else is in a Datsun, and I'll never be that funny, and I would never want to be in that position for that reason. But it's a tough balance. It's a tough balance to find, but I try and sort of follow the guest. There are guests who come in and they immediately want to play the game. And like, I can tell, somebody like Dan Kennedy, the author Dan Kennedy. When Dan Kennedy came on the show, like I knew right away, first answer, that that he was present with me and like wanted to have fun. And so I'll follow that. You know what I mean? I'll pull out that thread. And there's other guests who want to be really sincere. I mean, if you take a guest like a few years ago, I interviewed the rapper Petey Crack. I'm a big fan of Petey Crack, and he's been on a major label for a really long time. But he did this interview. It was by phone, unfortunately, but he did this interview where he really opened up and was really sincere, which you don't hear a lot from. I mean, rap is about constructing a persona, so you don't get that a lot from an MC, and I followed that. You know what I mean? So a lot of times it's about actually being there and sort of offering yourself and saying, I'm here. Are you?
Maybe this is an experience you have. This is very much an interviewer to interviewer question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you have the experience where a guest is there and prepared to give you essentially the blurb of their book? They have a prepared set of remarks and they come in ready to give you a speech, not even a facilitated speech, ready to give a speech. Do you find yourself having to break past that? Because I sometimes do.
Yeah, no, of course. One thing I like to do, I always read a lot of whatever interviews I can get my hands on of an upcoming guest, and that's sort of unusual. One of the reasons is it's always good to kind of know what they'll be excited to talk about. But another one of the reasons is to be able to tell what is their boilerplate. And what I try and do is, usually their boilerplate is something important, or else everyone wouldn't be asking them about it. But there are certain things that I can do expositorily that will give me the opportunity to ask the question from a different perspective or in a new way, or ask about some angle of it that hasn't been considered much. And occasionally somebody will really come in and try and steamroll me. I mean, I had Lloyd Kaufman in here the other day, the founder of Troma Films. And just the nicest guy in the universe.
I was so happy to see you got him.
Yeah, this guy seriously couldn't be nicer and more friendly. He invited me to stay at his home whenever I want. like 10 minutes into our conversation.
This is why you do public radio. It's why I do it.
Yeah, and he tried to steamroll me in the interview, and it was the same. It was funny because I had just had this experience a couple of weeks ago interviewing Jello Biafra. this is a guy who makes his living by talking for 2 hours straight extemporaneously, So I just try and kind of try and deflect it a little bit,
It's kind of, I recall your interview with Henry Rollins of Black Flag, now a spoken word artist from a while back, and he just started hammering you with his life, his views on his life philosophy. If you're hungry, man, I gotta feed you. And it was fun, but it was like, wow, I'm glad I wasn't Jesse during this interview, because it must have been intense.
Usually what I try and do is just find something that will surprise the guest a little bit, and not in like a sneak attack type of way, but
we should emphasize that the sound is the most ungotcha question show I've ever heard, anyway.
Oh yeah, I have less than no interest in gotcha questions, except in very rare instances. I just try and find new shades, and a lot of times if somebody gives me their boilerplate, I'll ask them sort of why. I mean, it's kind of a simple question, but I remember I asked Henry Rollins. It was years ago now that I talked to Henry Rollins, and I haven't listened to it since. But I remember asking Henry Rollins about being so like big and muscly.
Why is your neck so thick?
Yeah, but that's kind of that. Like, I really wanted to know, because it was obviously a choice. He obviously decided to start working out, and he told me, and he said something, and he said, "Oh, you're probably thinking of the old me. I was a lot more buff then." And I was like, I don't know. So the regular current you is still pretty ripped compared to me, for example. And why he would choose that, and that's like, I don't know. That's kind of an odd question, I guess, but it was something that I was sincerely curious about. And he actually, as I recall, and like I said, it was 5 years ago, he answered me pretty sincerely. I mean, Henry Rollins I thought that was a really great interview. I felt like I really learned a lot from him.
It was. I think it was pulled off successfully. Now, as far as the research that you do, or I should say the research that should be done during any or before any interview setting, have you ever gotten the situation, and this is something that I've just been dying to ask you because it's been my experience, where you will talk to, say, an author who's written a book. You'll talk for a good half hour or so, have a good conversation, you wrap it up, you hit stop on the computer, and the author looks shocked and says, "You actually read my book."
Yeah, totally, all the time. I mean, I have an easy job as an interviewer relative to other interviewers. If I was on the Today Show, my job would be so much harder, because, or even if I was hosting, the Marty and the Goose show, I don't know whether I would be Marty or the Goose. You'll have to decide. But whether I was hosting a morning zoo or hosting the Today Show or whatever, like, these folks have a trillion, billion, quadrillion things on their plates, and their interviews are 5 minutes long, so they can't really explore. They just have to have somebody that tells them, here's some points that we know will work. And so they just ask those points that they know will work. And if there's anything even slightly wrong about them, they don't have any room to recover, and they certainly don't have time to read a whole book. So I feel like I'm lucky to be in a position where I don't have to do it that way. Like, I'm really only interviewing 1.5 people a week, so I can really be ready for that interview. And to be frank, I don't always read the entire book. I know this is terrifying, but once in a while I don't have time to read the entire book. Once in a while I just have to read a big part of the book and then skim other parts of the book and read a lot of reviews of the book and interviews with the author.
I think that they are sometimes still impressed with that, though, which, I mean, I can't help but think that something is wrong when someone who has done so many interview cycles on public radio still expresses surprise that I or you or whoever has actually ingested the text of the book that they've written and are ostensibly there to promote.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like I said, I hosted a morning show on XM for a week. And not because I got fired. I was filling in for someone. It was so hard. It was so hard. I feel like I'm lucky to be in a position where I get to do it this way. And it's really too bad that there aren't more outlets out there that are like this. On the other hand, I feel lucky to be in a position where I get to do it.
To touch back on something we mentioned a bit earlier, I don't know if you've thought of it in these terms that I'm about to use, but with the idea of facilitated speech versus injecting one's own personality, one of the qualities of the sound that really pulled me in at first was, as distinct from a lot of what I was hearing already on public radio, though well produced, I found I wasn't hearing a lot of, I'll put it this way, I was hearing a lot of interviews, but not a lot of conversations, and the distinction I make there is that one is predominantly one way, the other is predominantly a two-way exchange. Now, conversation, I suppose, is the one I prefer because for a lot of time since high school, my interviewing or conversation, if you want to call it, idol has been, say what you will about him, Charlie Rose, who does one of the few examples on television of a two-way sort of exchange. Now, do you think of your own interviews as in the two-way circle of the Venn diagram, or am I just perceiving it differently than you do?
I understand the distinction that you're making. I mean, one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to use the word conversation is that I feel like my interviews are always, and I think this is very true of Charlie Rose as well, I think they're very focused on the guest and the guest's ideas. I think it just so happens that I'm actually interested in the guest and the guest's ideas and sort of engaged with them. In a way that a lot of folks aren't. You know, Charlie Rose is. And I think that's what happens. You can get so invested in being dispassionate that you lose all your passion. I don't think it's the right format for every show, but it's the show that I want to do, and usually the show that I want to listen to.
Now, anybody who follows the sound, especially on the website, MaximumFun.org, where there's a blog and there's a forum and more, will not only be following the content of your programs, but they'll also be following, I don't want to call it necessarily a struggle, but the journey of the Sound of Young America to get more national exposure, to be on more radio stations nationally. What are the obstacles to wider distribution of the Sound of Young America, to your mind?
Public radio program directors.
This is going to be a can of worms.
There's about 200 of them. Those, I would say, are the obstacles. It's available to them, and they have not thus far, by and large, chosen to avail themselves of that availability. Here's the thing. Public radio has spent 20 years developing a very specific aesthetic. I think to someone outside of public radio, my show fits that aesthetic pretty well. It's an in-depth interview show. It's format-wise very close to like Fresh Air. But to people inside public radio, it hews very far from that aesthetic. So public radio program directors, a lot of this is conjecture, but a lot of public radio program directors came up through news. And no public radio program directors came up through entertainment. So the main entry-level job in public radio is as a reporter. And so when you're putting together a 3 or 4 minute piece, you learn certain values that aren't necessarily the values of my show. They have to do with being sound rich, which is a big catchphrase in public radio. They have to do with being incredibly punchy and essentially being 3 minutes long, conveying something in 3 minutes. Whereas my show is about being half an hour long. You know, I'm doing a half-hour interview with someone, and they perceive it as being very kind of breezy. They perceive it as being too loose, not heavily edited enough. You know, one big difference between my show and Fresh Air is, Terry Gross will often do an hour or 90 minutes, not always, but often, with a guest for an interview that gets cut down to 20 or 25. And on my show, like, I'll often do 34 minutes with somebody on an interview that gets cut down to 29.
I do the exact same thing. They say, we recorded for an hour. How long is the broadcast? Going to be about 58:23.
Yeah, precisely. Because, frankly, that's just because I don't have the resources to do really long interviews. I don't have the resources to get guests for a really long time. I don't have the resources to do really long interviews and then spend a lot of time editing them, et cetera, right? So to public radio program directors, my show sounds crazy in a way that, boggles my mind, certainly. But, I mean, ultimately, what it's about is the median age of public radio audience members right now is like 52 or 53. I just went to a conference where there was a presentation about about the public radio audience and their use of technology. There were the audience was separated into two demographics, older and younger, and that was, to be specific, that was older was 53 and up, and younger was 52 and below. So a young listener in public radio is anyone 52 years old or younger, right?
And This American Life, the young show of public radio, it's not a young show anymore, but a hit with the most young people, has an average listener age of, I want to say, 47.
Yeah, and Ira's, that's about how old Ira is, Again, another superhero of mine. But basically, it's funny that you brought up This American Life. Like, the one big success that is different from the traditional public radio sound is This American Life, which in some ways is just an extension of the traditional public radio sound, but is very unique and does have a much kind of hipper audience than a lot of things on public radio. But A, that was 10 years ago, and B, most of the efforts in public radio towards getting younger or hipper have been in the direction of making second-rate versions of This American Life.
I've heard a bunch of them.
Yeah, which is, has created a lot of really great stuff, but again, doesn't have anything to do with what I do. So, there's lots of amazing audio documentaries that never would have existed without the influence of This American Life, but I'm not making audio documentaries. So ultimately, these program directors look at my guest list. They don't recognize any of the names, and they listen to my tone. And it's a little bit more jovial, and they think, you know what? This is for young people. It's not for my audience. It's hard to get any public radio station any public radio show on the air. Shows with $1 million budgets, NPR's Day to Day just got canceled, and I'm sure they were spending, $3, $4, $5 million a year. But in my case, it seems to have been particularly difficult. But, we're making slow and steady progress. I'm really proud to be on the stations that I'm on. I'm on WNYC in New York, WHYY in Philadelphia. That's two of the biggest public radio stations in the country. So, there's folks who are, there's a lot of folks in public radio who like the show, but there's a lot more for whom it seems a little bit foreign.
It does seem to be a leitmotif on what you write on the blog, and by way of full disclosure to the audience, because I don't want anybody emailing me about this, yes, I do write for the MaximumFun.org blog, and so the terrible conflict of interest here has been revealed. So
you do write for free, though.
I do write completely for free. Now, what I was going to say about this was that on the blog you express, it's not complaint so much, it's not even dismay, it's more just a kind of deep concern that maybe the vast majority of the public radio establishment in America doesn't realize that they're marginalizing themselves out of cultural relevance. Is that what you actually think, or am I getting a mistaken impression here?
Yeah, what you probably can hear in my voice and in my voice, my writing voice, is it gets very frustrating, it would be frustrating for me if I was doing, I've talked, for example, to the producers of the show, Away with Words. They're just super nice. And, they have a lot of the same frustrations, given a concept, their show's premise is much less antithetical to the, personal perspective of program directors as mine. And, they get the same frustrations because it's just really hard to get a public radio show on the air on stations. But, here's the thing. I think it's just ultimately the issue is that public radio has done such a spectacular job of doing what they're doing that their audience is still growing in a time when it is literally the only segment of the radio market and one of the few of broadcast in general that's still growing, because they've done a really kick-ass job of making morning edition-like programming. And they've been doing that for 20 years. And in the last 20 years, like, the new things that have come along are literally Wait, Don't Tell Me in This American Life. That's it. Over 20 years, and because they've been so focused on doing a great job of making Morning Edition and All Things Considered and shows like them, Weekend Edition and et cetera, on and on. So what happens, I think, is that you just have this generation of people who have been really successful doing a really great job of a really important thing. and they just don't see enough incentive to risk what they've built on new things, especially new things that seem like they could alienate their audience or seem like they don't have the polish of the stuff that they've been putting on the air. And I can understand that, but it's tough to be in my position.
Certainly. Now, I don't want to have us sound like we're picking specifically on public radio, because I don't think this is a problem unique to public radio. To go back to something that happened on the website recently, Adam Carolla, formerly of Loveline, the nightly talk show, and of recently canceled, more of a morning zoo, which was always something he hated, so I never understood that show on KLSX. After that show ended, he started his own podcast, became the #1 podcast on iTunes immediately, with this opening rant that I thought was so incisive that I had to transcribe myself and spend like an hour and a half doing it, posted it to the Maximum Fun forum, and you posted it on the blog, where Adam says that in any segment of radio, he comes from commercial radio, and I have a background in that as well, there's this segment of people that he calls beavers who are so ingrained in one behavior, like a beaver is in dam building, that they will do it no matter the outside conditions. And I didn't know how much this applied to public radio as commercial radio, where it is bad. But you've said that it's not entirely different in public radio, am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm impressed at the extent to which the extent of public radio's myopia about media and their place in it. I think a lot of public radio's success in new media has been because public radio's values are totally in the right place. And also that new technology has, podcasting, for example, public radio thinks of the public interest first. And that worked out really well when that meant, put out a podcast and figure out how to get money from it later. So, I think public radio's values are totally in the right place. But, you meet with a lot of public radio people and you get impressed as to the extent to which their understanding of the media world is completely driven by public radio. And I mean, I'm not exempt from this myself. I listen to get my news from public radio, but yeah, there's a real myopia, and I don't think it's quite as bad as it is in commercial radio. I worked briefly in commercial radio and was just, I'm just blown away.
Yeah, Adam Carolla was not exaggerating. He was being conservative, if anything.
Yeah, and, just the very prospect that, that how many stars does commercial radio have? It has one, Adam Carolla. At least a commercial, at least FM, at least if you exclude political talk. And, and they just threw him away. You know what I mean? All media is myopic, but radio in particular, I think, has just been, it's had its success both on the commercial side and on the public media side by hunkering down over the past 15, 20 years. Commercial media, commercial radio in terms of the mergers that have happened and so on, and, the emergence of research on both sides. Really what's happened is people have been so busy hunkering down that they haven't realized basic stuff like, commercial radio still seems not to have figured out that they don't have any content. Like that, once their distribution channel loses primacy in 10 years, they're going to just be out of luck.
Yeah, commercial radio at this point has like a Danny Bonaducci and a copy of Selector.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, there's something else that's a bit of a creeping disease that it seems to point itself out to me every so often in any sector of media, in the radio.
And that's the gout.
It's exactly the gout. It affects a lot of toes in media. Sure. But besides the gout, second to the gout, is this notion that one's own audience is kind of below oneself. It's an underestimation of the audience. I'll give you an example. When I was doing music commercial radio, my program director said to me, okay, when you're talking on the mic, don't picture someone hip. You got to picture a chunky 50-year-old white guy in a Hawaiian shirt. And sometimes I'll talk to public radio people and they will say something very similar. It's like they will find themselves picturing the stereotype, the cartoon stereotype, the 49-year-old walking between their Volvo to Crate and Barrel or back from Crate and Barrel to their Volvo. What do you see when you think of the Sound of Young America listener in your mind? Because it seems to be something a little less cartoonish than those two.
Yeah, well, basically my guiding philosophy on The Sound of Young America has been this. I've done this show so long and gotten paid so little that, like, and now I feel like I don't want to be whining about money because now the show like affords me an honest living, and I feel like so grateful for that. But when I did it the first 5 years in my free time from my full-time work and full-time schooling and wasn't getting paid anything, like, basically what can motivate me to do that? Well, stuff that I really like. So rather than worrying too much about the audience, I try and focus on stuff that I really like. And, I do worry about the audience in the sense that I try and make something that is worth listening to. And that's really important because I think a lot of times, especially in new media, people forget about making something that is actually worth consuming because they're so busy expressing themselves. But in terms of audience, like, I just feel like there are a lot of people out there who like fun and like cool stuff, and they're smart. You know what I mean? And like, those are the qualities that, those are the things that I care about. And I know there's other people out there because I know these people. And some of them are public radio listeners already. Some of them aren't. But, there's this huge media landscape. And if I can if I can point people to things that are good and also, help people learn more and connect more with things that they already think are good, then I'm doing a good job. You know what I mean?
There's a quality, since you bring this up to the show, that I don't know how quite to put it. Well, I'll phrase it like this. I was interviewing a foreign TV personality. Sorry to be so vague, but I don't like the name-dropping thing. And he said that he had trouble breaking into the U.S. market because England was where he was working. England and Australia and such, they're much more comfortable with the idea of serious thoughts coexisting with levity. And in America, for some reason, they're much less welcoming to that. Is that a phenomenon you have also observed?
Well, certainly in the mass media. I mean, I think that one of the cool things about the internet is that, it's a proving ground for that kind of stuff, like I know for a fact that, Patton Oswalt has an audience, and, Patton Oswalt doesn't have to demonstrate that by selling himself through 12 different gatekeepers who all think that everyone is dumb. You know what I mean? And I feel really lucky to have the internet, which is a place where, I can do something that, in my opinion is reasonably intelligent, and I don't have to get permission to do it from a million different people. And whether the audience for that kind of stuff is huge or modest, I don't really have to worry about it that much because I know there's at least enough people, as of right now, I know there's at least enough people to pay my rent. So, then I'll just keep doing it.
What was the place of public radio in your early life growing up? It seems like this is an institution that's been important to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've always been a public radio listener. And I mean, I don't say that. I used to listen to Wild 107.7 a little bit when I was like an adolescent. But, just to hear the latest Tony hits. But for the most part, like, I've been a public radio listener. And, I've spent some time as a teenager spending a lot of time with sports talk radio. And then sports talk radio, at least on my local station, kind of took a turn towards the kind of like, pour 'em a brew kind of thing that I wasn't very interested in, even as a 15-year-old,
And if they can't get the 15-year-olds, there's serious trouble.
Yeah. Well, I was a pretty weird 15-year-old.
Ah.
At the arts high school and everything. But I've always listened to public radio, and I've never thought of it as being something that like wasn't for me. You know what I mean? Like, I know some people like have this relationship with public radio like it's like a secret. Like sort of Jordan Morris, my co-host on Jordan Jesse Go, he grew up in Orange County. His mom likes to listen to, who's a super nice lady, really likes to listen to Dr. Laura. And so the music of his childhood is listening to Dr. Laura. And even when he sort of feels nervous, he's told me that sometimes he'll just put on he'll put on the Hot Talk station because it sort of makes him feel like he's at home.
It's like going back to the womb.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of people like that who sort of discover public radio and they're like, oh, there's other people like me. But like, frankly, I grew up in inner city San Francisco My parents are bohemian intellectuals. And so, like, what else were they going to listen to on the radio? You know what I mean? There's only one choice for those people. And so I listened to that a lot as a kid. And I really remember, and I always really enjoyed it. But I think, when This American Life came on the air, which was 10 years or so ago, maybe a little bit more, I remember hearing This American Life and thinking, wow, what is this? This is weird. This is really pretentious, is what I remember thinking. But then like listening to it and thinking, oh my God, this is great. This is amazing. This is actually, like, I don't have to kind of like adjust myself into public radio mindset to listen to public radio. Like, this feels like it's actually for me. And that made me think that public radio could be more than just something I listened to, and maybe it could be something I did when I was, 17 or 18 years old. So, in that sense, I owe that transition from being a public radio listener to thinking of myself as a potential public radio programmer to Mr. Ira Glass.
And what I think has been fairly very inspiring actually, about the sound, about listening to it for young people who want to do public radio, even for me, is that listening to the show, you can take it as a bit of a narrative, and you can hear Mr. Jesse Thorn getting closer and closer to, I don't know if I want to call them your idols, but it's great to hear people that you've obviously admired for a long time eventually wind up sitting there in your apartment, or sitting on the other end of a studio sink like we're doing right now. And with This American Life especially, it's great because you, of course, had Ira Glass on your show. And it seemed like, correct me if I'm wrong, but your relationship to that institution that is This American Life had developed to the point where you love it so much that that's the time you actually could break out a question or two that is more critical by the standards of the sound.
Well, I was so disappointed when I was researching for that This American Life interview, and obviously, like, at this point, I've listened to at least 90% of every episode of This American Life, especially thanks to a period in college where I would listen to This American Life's Real Audio archives whenever I had a migraine, and I get a lot of migraine headaches. So I was doing all this research, and I felt like nobody really asked Ira Glass about the sort of underlying philosophies of his show, and so I felt, some people said, oh, you really gave him the business.
You stuck it to him.
But like, I know that if anyone on earth has a strong underlying philosophy to what they do, it's Ira Glass. Like, that is a guy who spent 20 years working at National Public Radio. And I'm sure that whole time, he was thinking about, well, what do I want to do? And when he finally did it, it was really a struggle for him to do it. Like, This American Life didn't take off by itself. And
Ira Glass's story coming up is it's absurdly hard.
It's incredibly difficult. And Ira's one of those people, like, Ira just kind of happened into public radio. People think of him as being a sort of public radio native, and he is in the sense that he's always worked in public radio since he was 19, but he didn't care about public radio when he got the gig. But anyway, I knew that he had this really strong philosophy, and I also felt like really confident in knowing that, like, no one would think that I don't like Ira Glass. Like, obviously the guy's like my hero, you know what I mean? So, and he'd been really, I'd met him before, and he was really, really nice to me. So, and as he pointed out, jokingly, I have basically interviewed like 60% of the regular contributors to This American Life.
What you did was essentially encircle him.
Yeah, that's what he said.
Yes.
So, like, I felt like I could ask him some actually probing questions. And, a lot of times the best way to ask an actually probing question is just to kind of say, well, what about this? You know what I mean? And where in which this is something that's, mildly adversarial or a contrarian viewpoint. And, I don't think, like, if I felt like I would have embarrassed Ira in some way by doing that, I wouldn't have done it. Like, I didn't do it because I thought that maybe I would get, a deer in the headlights moment. I did it because I felt like that was the best way to get some, like, serious insight into the show, because I knew he had the answers. That's basically what it is. I asked those questions because I knew he had the answers, and I wanted to hear him say what he was thinking about.
And we should add, this episode freely available at MaximumFun.org. You can even subscribe.
Yeah, like all of my programming freely available at MaximumFun.org. It's another one of the principles I built the show on.
Now, we're talking about This American Life, something that you love, something that you've taken inspiration from, something that got you through a lot of migraines. There is another institution, maybe bigger, in the world of public radio that, through some of the things you've said, some of the responses to things people have asked you...
Are we going to talk about a Prairie Home Companion now?
We're going to talk about a Prairie Home Companion because you haven't said anything about it in a while. What do you actually regard that show as?
I want to start by saying this is I would choose to interpret this question as being in the same spirit as those tough questions I asked Ira Glass. First of all, I want to say that I like Garrison Keillor. I think he's funny. He has a beautiful voice. So that's number one. And I mean that totally sincerely. Like, I've read things that he's written that I thought were totally, really funny. He's also been a driving force behind some of the cooler things, the cooler experiments in public radio. You know, I think he's used his power for good for the most part. But I totally don't like a Prairie Home Companion. I really like, and I don't mean that as anything. Like, I really, you know, I don't want to be the guy who hates a Prairie Home Companion because, you know, I understand that people really love it, and that's totally fine with me. Like, I'm all for diversity, and part of diversity is that some of the things will be things that you don't like as much as other things. But I totally don't like a Prairie Home Companion. To me, there's a quality in the tone. Well, for one thing, I don't like the music at all, except when they have Randy Newman on. Like, the music is just like, if you really like worked hard to pick the music that I like the least, it would be the music on a Prairie Home Companion, which, you know, it's just a matter of personal taste completely. But I don't think that the comedy on the show is funny. It's not funny to me. And, you know, that's, again, a matter of personal taste. Not funny to me, but it's also like almost not comedy often.
It's kind of like a New Yorker cartoon.
I kind of like New Yorker cartoons sometimes.
Well, like a bad New Yorker
and like I said,
cartoon.
I think I find Garrison Keillor funny in other contexts. So it's not about Garrison Keillor not being funny. It's just kind of like, it's a sort of like, it's about, like, people treat it as though it's comedy when it's actually just kind of about tone. It's really the comedy snob in me that is upset by it. Like, there's a kind of a, I don't know. I mean, I bet the people who work for a Prairie Home Companion are just super nice, because basically everybody I've met in public radio is just crazy nice. But like, it's just not funny to me. I feel like it's barely even jokes.
That's reason enough, I think. It's if something being unfunny and being funny is a very important thing to you.
Yeah, no, it's basically all I care about in the entire world. There's a certain amount to which I care about my family, but mostly I care about being funny.
It's mostly effective humor that is not just tonal and that is not based mostly on made-up biscuit commercials.
Yeah, and when I say being funny, I'm not talking about me specifically. I just things that are funny. Yeah, I mean, the other thing about it that I don't like, and again, this is something that's very subjective, but there's something kind of it feels to me personally kind of like a little bit insincere and patronizing about the Midwestern ruralness of the show. You know, I don't think it's intended that way, and again, I think it sometimes Garrison Keillor can be really amazing, and I think it's a really amazing feat to put on that show every week. And he does it, you know, spectacularly, but it's just not for me, you know, and it's really dominant in the public radio world. But honestly, like, my feeling about it is that I would love to hear more stuff like a Prairie Home Companion on public radio, because a Prairie Home Companion and Car Talk as well, which I usually do like Car Talk, but they're both shows that are like really different from the other stuff on public radio. And outside of occasionally trying to copy them, public radio hasn't tried to do a lot of stuff that's different from the things on public radio. And both A Prairie Home Companion and Car Talk are both A, really old, not in terms of their audience or whatever. They've just been around a long time. So they were around before public radio got really careful about research and making sure everything is exactly like everything else. So they've both been and they're also both huge hits. You know, they're hugely popular. So they're sort of insulated against the vagaries of the public radio landscape by virtue of the fact that, you know, they're sort of institutions that can't be messed with. But I wish that public radio was more enterprising and there were people trying to do more. And that's something that I don't often see. And when I do see it, I rarely see support for it from stations. So, you know, there's shows that try and do something. Like, for example, one of the shows that Garrison Keillor produced a show called Pop Vultures. And like, I wasn't that nuts about the show, but it was a really interesting experiment and really sincerely trying to reach a new audience and like be its own thing. And it really just got left out on the laundry line, or whatever the expression is, by the public radio stations. And so it just kind of, after its grant money ran out 1 year in, it just kind of folded. You know, that's sort of what happened with Bryant Park Project and with Fair Game. And, you know, it happens with stuff that isn't just about younger listeners. I mean, that's what happened with, I don't know, just NPR's Justice Talking, for example. And I would love to see in radio more of the kind of entrepreneurialism and experimentalism that you see, I hate to say it, but in television.
Ah.
You know, people try things in television. Say what you will about TV, but in today's contemporary landscape, people do try stuff. You know what I mean? And one good way of finding out what works is by trying stuff. And public radio is institutionally, structurally set up in a way that's very hostile to trying stuff. And I think that's really problematic. So even if something like a Prairie Home Companion isn't necessarily for me, I'm really happy that there's room in the public radio landscape for something that's slightly different from other stuff on public radio.
Now, because I don't want to go out on a Prairie Home Companion themed note, there is, since we're coming up to the end of the hour, one thing I consider important to ask you. Now, we're both working on radio projects that are important to us, and there are certain qualities of them that I think we wouldn't relinquish even if it meant less success. For me, for example, it's the long form interviews. Maybe they'd be considered, maybe our interviews are XXL long form in the radio world. I don't know. But the bottom line there is that that's not something that I would sacrifice, even if sacrificing it meant the only hope for success. What component of the Sound of Young America would you never sacrifice?
The me component. And I think that ultimately what the Sound of Young America is about is, it's not about me, but it's about my perspective, you know? It's about me choosing the guests and doing things that I really believe in. And frankly, if I was going to do something where I wasn't choosing guests and doing something that I really believed in, I'd do something that paid a lot better. You know what I mean? Like the reason that I was cool making $18,000 a year for quite a number of years there was that I'm doing something that I really love and care about. And you know, there are situations in which I'd be willing to consider doing things that I didn't love and care about to that extent. But you know, not on the Sound of Young America. You know, the Sound of Young America, the things I do on MaximumFun.org are about the things that I really love and believe in. And you know, I wouldn't be willing to give that up for anything.
I agree with you 1,000%. Jesse, thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, it was really a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Colin.
Our theme music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of his work at benalthouse.com. And for our complete interview archive, other podcasts, and much more, visit ColinMarshallRadio.com.